In the grim darkness of the far future, there are encounters that defy expectation, moments where the carefully laid plans of the Imperium collide with the chaotic randomness of the galaxy's most unpredictable Xenos race. Picture, if you will, a battlefield long abandoned, where the dust of forgotten wars lies thick upon rusted metal and shattered stone. Here, beneath layers of debris and the slow accumulation of centuries, something sleeps. Not the sleep of death, but something far stranger, far more terrible. Within a tomb of blessed silver and consecrated adamantium, a warrior waits, his consciousness suspended between dreams and darkness, his last memories of battle fading like smoke on a wind that stopped blowing 1,000 years ago. This is not just any Space Marine dreadnought. This is a Grey Knight, one of the Emperor's most elite demon hunters, a psyker whose very existence is a secret kept from most of the Imperium. For a millennium, he has rested here, his sarcophagus sealed, his weapons silent, his psychic might dormant. The battlefield that claimed his brothers has been forgotten by all but the most ancient records. The enemies they fought here have long since turned to dust or been scattered to the warp. Even the planet's name has changed, its original designation lost to bureaucratic reshuffling and the slow erosion of imperial memory. But the galaxy is vast, and nothing stays buried forever, especially not when Orks are involved. The Greenskins have a saying, though few outside their race would understand its crude eloquence. "The best bits is the ones you find when you ain't looking." And so it was that a warband of Orks, drawn to this world by the promise of a good fight and the rumor of scrap worth looting, stumbled upon something they could never have expected, something that would challenge even their remarkable capacity for violence and chaos, something that, once awakened, would demonstrate why the Grey Knights are feared throughout the galaxy, even by those who do not know they exist. This is the story of what happens when the unstoppable force of Ork ingenuity meets the immovable object of Grey Knight's determination. It is a tale of ancient warriors and scrap-hungry looters, of psychic might and crude cunning, of sacred duty and simple greed. It is a story that could only happen in the twisted, violent, darkly humorous universe of Warhammer 40,000, where even 1,000 years of sleep cannot guarantee peace, and where the galaxy's most terrifying demon hunters can find themselves face to face with its most persistent nuisance. To understand the full implications of this encounter, we must first understand both parties involved. We must delve into the nature of Grey Knight's dreadnoughts, those walking tombs of psychic fury, and we must explore the peculiar genius of the Orks, whose ramshackle technology and unshakable belief in their own superiority makes them one of the galaxy's most dangerous threats. Only then can we truly appreciate the chaos that unfolds when these two forces collide. The Grey Knights. Dreadnought. A tomb of silver and psychic fire. To comprehend what the Orks have found, we must first understand what sets a Grey Knight's dreadnought apart from the already terrifying war machines employed by other Space Marine chapters. A standard dreadnought is itself a marvel of technology and a testament to the Imperium's refusal to let its heroes rest. When a Space Marine suffers wounds so catastrophic that even the advanced medical arts of the apothecaries cannot save him, when his body is broken beyond the point where augmetics can restore function, he may be offered a choice that is both honor and curse. His ruined form can be interred within the armored sarcophagus of a dreadnought, his consciousness linked to the machine's systems through psycho-cybernetic interfaces that blur the line between man and machine. For most Space Marine chapters, this is considered the highest honor. To continue serving the Emperor, even after mortal wounds would have claimed lesser warriors, is seen as the ultimate expression of duty. The dreadnoughts of chapters like the Ultramarines or the Dark Angels are revered as living legends, their wisdom sought by commanders, their presence on the battlefield inspiring their brothers to greater acts of valor. They are the old ones, the ancients, veterans of countless campaigns who carry within their metal shells the memories of wars fought when the Imperium was still young. But the Grey Knights are different. In almost every way, they diverge from the standard template of the Adeptus Astartes, and their approach to dreadnoughts is no exception. Unlike their cousins in other chapters, the Grey Knights do not view internment in a dreadnought as an honor to be sought. Instead, it is seen as a burden, a necessity that prevents a warrior from earning the rest he has more than earned. Every Grey Knight knows that when his service finally ends, his proper place is in the crypts beneath the fortress monastery on Titan, Saturn's moon, where the cool earth and the blessed stone will cradle his remains for eternity. There, in the dead fields, his name will be inscribed alongside his fallen brothers, a final rest in a place of peace and contemplation. To be denied this rest, to be locked instead within a walking tomb of metal and ceramite, is to be denied the peace that every Grey Knight secretly yearns for. They accept it when necessary, when their expertise or their strength is deemed too valuable to lose. But they do not celebrate it. Each Grey Knight's dreadnought represents not triumph, but sacrifice of the most profound kind. A warrior who gives up even the hope of final rest to continue the endless war against chaos. What makes these dreadnoughts truly unique, however, is not their reluctance, but their capabilities. Every Grey Knight is a psyker, their minds capable of channeling the power of the warp to devastating effect. They are trained from their earliest days to resist the corruption that claims lesser psykers, their souls fortified by rituals and wards that make them all but immune to the temptations of chaos. When a Grey Knight is interred within a dreadnought, these psychic abilities do not diminish. If anything, they are amplified, focused through psycho-reactive circuitry that transforms the dreadnought into a conduit for powers that would destroy an ordinary machine. The sarcophagus of a Grey Knight's dreadnought is not merely a life support system. It is a psychic resonator, etched with hexagrammic wards and inscribed with prayers in languages older than the Imperium itself. These inscriptions are not mere decoration. They are active components of what the Grey Knights call the Aegis, a network of psychic defenses that shields the warrior within from the corrupting influence of demons and the predations of malevolent warp entities. While all Grey Knights bear these wards tattooed upon their flesh and inscribed upon their armor, the Dreadnought's Aegis is far more powerful, a fortress of faith and psychic might that can repel even greater demons. This Aegis does more than protect the pilot. It can extend outward, linking with the psychic defenses of nearby Grey Knights to create a network of wards far stronger than any individual could maintain. On the battlefield, a Grey Knight's dreadnought becomes a linchpin of psychic defense, a beacon of sanctified power that strengthens his brothers while weakening the grip that demons maintain upon reality. The very presence of such a machine is painful to entities of the warp, their forms flickering and weakening as the Aegis burns away at their connection to the materium. But this psychic capability comes at a cost. The strain of maintaining such power, even in dormancy, is immense. The warrior within must remain in a state of semi-consciousness even during sleep, his mind never truly at rest, always alert for the whisper of daemonic presence or the taint of chaos. Dreams, when they come, are not the random firings of a sleeping mind, but prophetic visions, glimpses of battles yet to come, or worse, memories of battles long past that play out with perfect, terrible clarity. Some Grey Knight's dreadnoughts report that after centuries of such half-sleep, they can no longer distinguish between memory and prophecy, between the wars they have fought and the wars they will fight. The weapons mounted upon a Grey Knight's dreadnought reflect their specialized role. Where other dreadnoughts might carry assault cannons or multi-melters, Grey Knight's variants are often equipped with psi cannons, weapons that fire bolts of psychically charged ammunition, capable of tearing apart both physical matter and warp stuff with equal efficacy. Their close combat weapons are not mere power fists, but nemesis doom fists. Force weapons scaled up to dreadnought size, capable of channeling the pilot's psychic might into blows that can shatter demon princes and crack open enemy vehicles with contemptuous ease. Perhaps most remarkable is the Dreadnought's ability to continue casting psychic powers even while engaging in physical combat. A Grey Knight's librarian might struggle to maintain concentration on a complex ritual while dodging enemy fire, but a Dreadnought, protected by meters of blessed armor and shielded by the Aegis, can unleash devastating psychic assaults while simultaneously laying waste to enemies with physical weapons. Hammerhand, a power that infuses weapons with destructive psychic energy, becomes terrifying when channeled through a Dreadnought's massive arms. Gate of Infinity, which allows for short-range teleportation, can move a multi-ton war machine across the battlefield in the blink of an eye. The machine spirit of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is unlike those found in other Imperial machines, whether through the constant psychic emanations of its pilot or through some deeper mystery of its construction. These Dreadnoughts seem almost alive in ways that unnerve even experienced tech priests. They respond to prayers and blessings with a readiness that suggests understanding rather than mere programming. Some have been known to activate defensive systems moments before an attack that no sensor could have detected, as if warned by psychic prescience. Others have broken free of restraints to join battles they were meant to sit out, driven by some compulsion that even their pilots cannot fully explain. Maintenance of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is a sacred duty performed only by the chapter's most skilled tech marines, warrior craftsmen who have studied under the tech priests of Mars but remain first and foremost servants of the Emperor and the Grey Knights. These tech marines must undergo additional training in psychic wards and demonic lore, for they work with machines that channel powers most tech priests would consider heretical. Every component must be blessed, every connection sanctified, every ammunition drum inscribed with prayers of banishment and protection. The sacred oils used in their maintenance are mixed with holy water from Titan's deepest sanctuaries. The incense burned during their awakening rituals contains ash from texts too dangerous to preserve intact. When not in use, Grey Knight's Dreadnoughts are kept in special chambers deep within the fortress monastery, rooms that are equal parts armory, chapel, and tomb. Here, in the cool darkness, they rest between battles, their systems in minimal power mode, their pilots lost in dreams that may last decades or even centuries. The chapter's chaplains maintain a vigil over these chambers, monitoring the Dreadnoughts for any sign of psychic disturbance or spiritual corruption. Such vigilance is necessary, for even a Grey Knight's iron will can falter after centuries of service, and the consequences of a Dreadnought falling to corruption would be catastrophic. The awakening of a Grey Knight's Dreadnought is not undertaken lightly. Unlike some chapters that might deploy their ancients for relatively minor engagements, the Grey Knights reserve their Dreadnoughts for the most dire threats. When a greater demon manifests, when a demonic incursion threatens to tear apart reality itself, when the very existence of a world hangs in the balance, then, and only then, do the master armorers begin the rituals of awakening. The process takes hours, sometimes days, involving prayers and psychic attunements that gradually pull the warrior's consciousness back from whatever dark dreams have held him. For the pilot, awakening is a jarring experience. One moment, there is the familiar darkness of sleep, the dim awareness of time passing like sand through an hourglass. The next, there is light, sensation, the crushing weight of duty settling once more upon shoulders that have not felt its burden in decades or longer. Some Dreadnoughts emerge from sleep, believing they are still fighting, battles that ended before their slumber began. Others wake disoriented, struggling to place themselves in time, to understand which war they have been awakened to fight. The tech marines and chaplains who oversee the awakening must be patient, guiding the ancient back to full awareness, briefing him on the current threat, reminding him of the sacred duty that compels him to fight once more. And once awakened, once the mighty war machine is powered up and its weapons systems activated, the Grey Knight's Dreadnought becomes one of the most formidable weapons in the Imperium's arsenal. Standing twice the height of a man, encased in armor that can shrug off Lascanon blasts and demon claws with equal ease, armed with weapons that can kill at any range, and piloted by a warrior whose psychic might can tear holes in reality, such a machine is worth 100 battle tanks and 1,000 soldiers. Enemies scatter before it. Demons howl in pain at its approach. Even the mightiest champions of chaos have learned to fear the silver giant, whose very presence weakens their hold upon the material world. This, then, is what sleeps beneath the rubble of that forgotten battlefield. This is what the Orks are about to find. A weapon designed to fight the most terrible entities in the galaxy. A warrior who has slain demon princes and banished greater demons. A psyker whose mind is a fortress against which the powers of the warp break like waves upon stone. And he has been asleep for 1,000 years, lost to time, his very existence forgotten by all but the most ancient records in the fortress monastery on Titan. The Orks, in their ramshackle enthusiasm and crude cunning, are about to learn why the Grey Knights are the Emperor's chosen demon hunters. They are about to discover that some sleeping giants should be left undisturbed. But being Orks, they will learn this lesson in the most direct, violent, and thoroughly entertaining way possible. The Greenskin Genius. Understanding Ork technology and psychology. To understand what happens when Orks encounter a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, we must first understand the Orks themselves, for they are unlike any other race in the galaxy. They are not merely enemies of the Imperium or obstacles to be overcome. They are a force of nature, a green tide of violence and chaos that has plagued the galaxy since before humanity took its first steps toward the stars. They are the Orks, and they are perfect in their simplicity and terrifying in their effectiveness. The Orks were not born. They were made, engineered by the ancient Old Ones as weapons in a war so ancient that even the Eldar remember it only in fragments and myths. Originally called the Krork, these warrior constructs were designed as the perfect soldiers, beings who could reproduce rapidly, adapt to any environment, and wage war with an enthusiasm that never flagged. The Old Ones are long gone, their civilization destroyed in that ancient war, but their creations endure. The Orks have spread across the galaxy, a living ecosystem that transforms every world it touches into a factory for producing more warriors. At the heart of Ork biology is a paradox that has baffled Imperial xenobiologists for millennia. Orks are simultaneously incredibly sophisticated and incredibly crude. Their bodies are symbiotic fusions of animal and fungal matter, allowing them to survive wounds that would kill any other creature, and to reproduce through spores released throughout their lives, and especially at the moment of death. This means that any world touched by Orks becomes infected with them, the spores taking root in the soil and eventually producing new generations of greenskins, long after the original invaders have been defeated. But it is not their biology that makes Orks truly dangerous. It is their collective psychic field, the phenomenon they call the Way-Geg. Every Ork generates a subtle psychic energy, a byproduct of their existence that individually amounts to little. But when Orks gather in large numbers, when they are united in purpose and excited by the prospect of violence, this energy combines into something far greater than the sum of its parts. The WAG field warps reality itself, making the impossible merely improbable and the improbable almost certain. This is the secret of Ork technology. Their weapons and vehicles should not work. By any logical understanding of physics and engineering, a gun slapped together from scrap metal, spare parts, and wishful thinking should explode in the user's face or simply fail to function. An Ork vehicle, with its crude welding and complete disregard for concepts like structural integrity or safety margins, should fall apart the moment it attempts to move. Yet they work, and they work reliably, because the Orks believe they will work. The WH field subtly adjusts probability, fills in the gaps in their ramshackle engineering, and makes their crude creations function as well as anything produced by the Adeptus Mechanicus. This is not to say that Ork technology is magic, or that belief alone makes it function. The mech boys, the Ork engineers who build and maintain their technology, are not merely pretending to know what they are doing. They possess genuine knowledge, instinctive understanding of mechanical principles encoded in their very genetics by the old ones who created them. A mech boy does not learn to build an engine by studying blueprints or attending a technical academy. The knowledge simply comes to him, bubbling up from some deep genetic memory, manifesting as an irresistible urge to collect certain components and assemble them in specific ways. But this knowledge is incomplete, fragmentary, more intuition than understanding. A mech boy can build a functional engine, but if you ask him to explain how it works, he will struggle to articulate the principles involved. He knows that this part connects to that part, that this wire needs to go here, and that bolt needs to be tightened there, but he could not tell you why. He simply knows, the same way a bird knows how to build a nest without ever being taught. This is where the WH field becomes crucial. It fills in the gaps in the mech boy's knowledge, smooths over the mistakes in his crude construction, and makes his half-functional contraptions actually function. The result is technology that is simultaneously brilliant and terrible. Ork weapons can match or even exceed Imperial equipment in raw destructive power, but they are wildly unpredictable. An Ork shooter might fire with deadly accuracy for hours, then suddenly explode without warning, or it might jam after the first shot, or it might function perfectly for years. The Orks accept this unpredictability as part of life. If a weapon fails, they simply hit it until it works again, or find a new one. If a vehicle breaks down, they patch it with whatever materials are at hand and keep driving. Failure is merely an opportunity for improvisation. Mech boys occupy a special place in Ork society. They are odd boys, Orks who are born with a particular specialization, a genetic predisposition toward a certain role. Where some Orks are born to fight and others to lead, mech boys are born to build. From the moment they emerge from their spawning grounds, they are obsessed with machinery, drawn to it the way a moth is drawn to flame. Young spanners, as apprentice mech boys are called, will spend hours taking things apart just to see how they work, much to the annoyance of the Orks whose property they disassemble. As a mech boy grows and gains experience, his abilities develop. He learns to build more complex machines, to combine components in new and interesting ways, to push the limits of what Ork technology can achieve. The greatest mech boys, the big mechs, are capable of creating weapons and vehicles that rival anything produced by the other races. They understand principles of physics and engineering that would astound Imperial scientists, even if they cannot explain those principles in any systematic way. A big mech might build a teleporter that actually works, or a force field generator that can stop a tank shell, or a gravity gun that can flip a Titan upside down. What makes mech boys particularly dangerous is their love of looting. Orks are natural scavengers, but mech boys take this to an extreme. They are fascinated by the technology of other races, not out of any scientific curiosity, but out of pure acquisitiveness. They see a working machine and immediately want to take it apart, figure out how it works, and then build their own version. Or more commonly, they simply steal the machine, bolt it onto one of their own contraptions, and see what happens. This looting behavior has given rise to one of the Imperium's most persistent tactical headaches, the looted wagon. These are vehicles that Orks have captured from their enemies and then modified to suit their purposes. An Imperial chimera might be looted and turned into a cart, a crude transport that bounces across the battlefield at terrifying speeds, its original armor reinforced with random plates of scrap metal and its weapons replaced with whatever the mech boys had lying around. A Lehman Russ battle tank might become a wagon, its turret replaced with a massive cannon that fires entirely too much, and its treads reinforced to handle speeds that would have horrified its original designers. Even super-heavy tanks like Baneblades have been looted and turned into battle fortresses, mobile strongholds bristling with weapons and covered in spiky bits. The process of looting is instructive. When Orks find a vehicle they want, they first have to defeat its crew, which usually involves hitting it until it stops moving. Then they haul it back to their camp, where mech boys swarm over it like green locusts, pulling off bits they do not understand or do not like, and replacing them with Orky equivalents. Sophisticated targeting systems are ripped out and replaced with simple iron sights. Comfortable crew compartments are stripped bare to make room for more ammunition or more boys. Safety features are discarded as un-Orky. The result is a vehicle that is faster, more heavily armed, and far more dangerous than it has any right to be, though also far more likely to explode without warning. This love of looting extends to everything the Orks encounter. They will loot weapons, armor, machinery, even buildings if they can figure out how to move them. Some Ork tribes have become famous for their looting prowess. The Death Skulls clan believes that blue is a lucky color, and that anything painted blue will work better, so they paint everything they loot blue before using it. This has led to the bizarre sight of blue Imperial tanks charging across battlefields alongside Ork buggies, their original insignia hastily painted over with Ork glyphs. The Orks' approach to looting is not sophisticated. They do not carefully study the technology they capture to understand its principles. They simply grab it, hit it until it works the way they want, and then use it until it breaks. If it cannot be easily modified to suit their purposes, they will either scrap it for parts or give it to the Gretchen to use. The concept of reverse engineering or technological espionage is alien to them. They are interested in results, not understanding. This brings us to a crucial point about Ork psychology. They are not stupid, despite what their crude language and simple culture might suggest. They are simply focused on different priorities. An Ork does not care about the why or the how of something. He cares about the what and the does it work. If you showed an Ork a lascannon and explained the physics of how it transforms energy into a beam of coherent light, he would not be impressed by the explanation. But if you demonstrated that it could blow a hole through an armored vehicle, suddenly you would have his full attention. This pragmatism extends to their approach to leadership. Orks follow the biggest and strongest among them because in their society, might makes right. The biggest Ork is almost always the most successful Ork, the one who has survived the most fights and claimed the most loot. This creates a natural hierarchy where the most capable rise to the top through a process of constant, violent culling. An Ork warboss is not merely big. He is a tactical genius by Ork standards, capable of coordinating the efforts of thousands of greenskins, reading a battlefield, and adapting his strategy on the fly. When Orks gather in sufficient numbers and find a strong enough leader, they form a WAG, a massive military migration that sweeps across entire star systems, destroying everything in its path. A WAG is partly a holy crusade, partly a pub crawl, and partly an excuse for the largest fight imaginable. Orks from across the sector are drawn to it, pulled by the psychic call of the Tal, WAG field like moths to a flame. The more Orks join, the stronger the WAG becomes, and the stronger the WAG becomes, the more Orks it attracts. This creates a feedback loop that can transform a minor skirmish into a sector-wide catastrophe. During a WAG, Orks become more than they normally are. The psychic energy flowing through them makes them stronger, faster, more cunning. Their weapons work better, their vehicles run faster, and their confidence reaches stratospheric levels. They believe, with absolute certainty, that they cannot be beaten, and the WAG field makes that belief almost true. Even when losing, Orks in a WAG will fight with a ferocity that puts even the most fanatical human soldiers to shame, because for them, the fight itself is the point. Winning is good, but fighting is better. This is the mentality that drives orcs to investigate anything interesting they find on a battlefield. A human might see a suspicious object and call for engineers or specialists to examine it safely. An orc sees something shiny and metal and immediately wants to take it apart to see if there is anything worth looting inside. Safety is not a concern. Caution is for weaker races. If it explodes, well, that is just part of the fun. So when a group of orcs stumbles upon a strange metal sarcophagus buried beneath the rubble of an ancient battlefield, they do not think about what it might be or why it was buried there. They do not consider that it might be dangerous or that disturbing it might have consequences. They see a massive piece of technology that is clearly valuable, and their first thought is, "That's mine." Their second thought is, "What's inside?" And their third thought is, "Let's smash it open and find out." The collision between orc curiosity and Grey Knight's technology is about to create a situation that no Imperial tactical manual has ever covered, because no Imperial commander has ever been foolish enough to let orcs anywhere near a Damatsan, sleeping Dreadnought. What happens next will test the limits of both orc ingenuity and Grey Knight's patience, though in very different ways. The discovery. When scrap becomes destiny. The orcs had come to this world following the most reliable of all navigational aids, the sound of distant fighting. A nearby system was embroiled in some petty human conflict, the details of which neither interested nor concerned the greenskins. What mattered was that there was a war happening, which meant there would be fighting, and where there was fighting, there would be loot. The war boss, a massive brute called Gutgrinder, had decided that his boys needed a proper warm-up before joining the main scrap, and this dead world seemed like the perfect place to practice. The planet had once been something, though what exactly was unclear. The ruins that dotted its surface suggested human habitation, but they were old, worn smooth by wind and time until it was impossible to tell what they had originally been. Occasionally, the orcs would find something interesting buried in the debris, a weapon, a piece of machinery, once even the rusted hulk of what might have been an Imperial tank. These discoveries sent the mech boys into ecstasies of joy, and they would spend hours arguing over who got to loot which bits. It was during one such argument that young Snazrog made his discovery. Snazrog was what the orcs called a youth, a young greenskin still figuring out his place in the warband. He was not particularly big or strong, which meant he got the worst jobs and the smallest share of any loot. On this particular day, he had been assigned to dig through a collapsed building, searching for anything worth salvaging, while the bigger boys argued over more obvious prizes. Snazrog had been digging for hours, his massive hands pulling aside chunks of rockcrete and twisted metal, with the methodical patience of someone who knows that complaining will only earn him a thump on the head. He was about to give up and report that there was nothing worth finding when his fingers brushed against something different. Not rock, not rusted metal, but something smooth and cold, a surface that felt almost alive beneath his touch. Curious, Snazrog began digging with more enthusiasm, pulling aside larger chunks of debris, following the edge of whatever he had found. It was big, bigger than anything he had expected to find. As more of it was revealed, he realized it was not just big, it was massive. And it was metal, real metal, not the corroded scrap that littered the rest of the battlefield. This was good metal, thick and solid, the kind that mech boys would fight each other for. The surface was also strange. It was covered in markings, symbols that hurt Snazrog's eyes when he tried to focus on them. They seemed to writhe and shift, though when he looked directly at them, they were perfectly still. There were words too, though not in any language Snazrog could read. They were etched deep into the metal, filled with a substance that might once have been silver, but had darkened with age to the color of old blood. Snazrog's excitement grew. This was clearly something important, something valuable. He needed to tell the others, but he also needed to make sure they knew that he had found it, that it was his discovery. Ownership was a fluid concept among orcs, determined primarily by who was big enough to defend their claim, but finding something first gave you at least a temporary right to it. "Oi, boss!" Snazrog's bellow carried across the battlefield, interrupting the ongoing argument about who got to keep the tank treads. "I found something!" The effect was immediate. Every orc in the vicinity turned to look at him, their interest piqued. Gutgrinder, the war boss, was the first to move, his massive frame covering the distance in surprisingly few strides. The other orcs followed, forming a crowd around Snazrog's excavation site. "What is it, you get?" Gutgrinder's voice was like rocks grinding together, deep and rough. "Dunno, boss," Snazrog admitted, gesturing at the partially exposed surface. "But it's big and metal and covered in weird scratches." Gutgrinder peered at the discovery, his small eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The visible portion was rectangular, maybe 2 meters across, and extending down into the rubble further than they could see. The metal was grey, or maybe silver. It was hard to tell in the dim light. The symbols covering it definitely did something odd to his vision, making him want to look away, even as curiosity demanded he examine them more closely. Could be good loot, Gutgrinder decided. Dig it out. What followed was organized chaos, which is to say it was chaos with a vague sense of purpose. 24 orcs descended on the site, pulling aside rubble with their bare hands, some digging, others forming a chain to pass debris away from the excavation. The Gretchen, smaller cousins to the orcs, were sent into the tighter spaces, squeezing through gaps to clear away smaller obstructions. As more of the object was revealed, its shape became clearer. It was not just a rectangular block, but something more complex. A sarcophagus of some kind, armored and heavily reinforced. There were what looked like weapons mounted on it, though they were folded tight against the main body in what might have been a defensive position. There were also ports and hatches, though none of them seemed inclined to open. The mech boys were beside themselves with excitement. Big Mech Klobsnik, Gutgrinder's chief engineer, pushed his way through the crowd to examine the discovery more closely. He ran his hands over the surface, tracing the lines of the symbols, tapping on the metal to gauge its thickness. His eyes, already beady and small in his massive green face, narrowed to slits as he concentrated. "This ain't normal Yumi tech," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had looted. Enough Imperial equipment to know what he was talking about. "This is proper fancy stuff. Real good metal. None of that cheap rubbish the Yumis usually use. And dizzy symbols." He tapped one of the inscriptions, then jerked his hand back as if it had burned him. "Daisy is weird. Real weird." "What's it do?" Gutgrinder wanted to know. Klobsnik shrugged, a gesture that looked odd on someone his size. "Dunno. But it's got power in it. I can feel it. Something big and strong, all wrapped up tight. Like a really good engine, but different." This was both exciting and frustrating. The orcs had found something valuable, something powerful, but they could not figure out what it was or how to get inside it. The hatches were sealed tight, resistant to even the strongest orcs' attempts to pry them open. The metal was too thick to cut through with the tools they had on hand. Even shooting it, which several orcs suggested, and one actually attempted, only resulted in ricochets and one wounded orc who had been standing too close. "We need to get it back to camp," Gutgrinder decided. "Klobsnik, you and your boys figure out how to open it up. Rest of yous help dig it out and get it on a wagon." This proved easier said than done. The sarcophagus was heavy, far heavier than its size suggested it should be. It took 20 orcs, straining together to lift it even a few inches, and moving it any significant distance required a combination of brute force and crude leverage. Eventually, they managed to load it onto a salvaged truck bed, though the vehicle's suspension groaned alarmingly under the weight. The journey back to the orc camp was slow and punctuated by frequent stops to repair the increasingly strained transport. Every orc who saw the prize wanted to know what it was, and Gutgrinder found himself repeating, "Dunno, but we're gonna find out," so many times it became a kind of mantra. By the time they reached camp, word of the discovery had spread throughout the warband. Mech boys from every mob were gathering, drawn by curiosity and the promise of looting something truly unusual. Arguments broke out immediately about who had the right to work on it, who would get first pick of whatever was inside, and what they should try first. Gutgrinder, showing the kind of wisdom that had made him war boss in the first place, decreed that Klobsnik would lead the investigation, but any mech who wanted to help could do so. This satisfied most parties, though there was still considerable jostling for position as the sarcophagus was unloaded and placed in the center of the mech workshop. The workshop was exactly what you would expect from an Ork engineering facility. A chaotic sprawl of half-finished projects, piles of scrap, mysterious devices that might be weapons or might be sculptures, and tools ranging from delicate precision instruments to massive sledgehammers. The centerpiece was a truly massive workbench made from what appeared to be the hull of a tank, its surface scarred and burned from 1,000 projects. The sarcophagus was placed on this bench, and the mech boys gathered around it like surgeons preparing for a particularly interesting operation. Klobsnik took the lead, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he examined every inch of the surface. "Right," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone who was making things up as he went along, but was confident enough that nobody would call him on it. "First thing, we need to figure out what this is. Any of yous lot seen anything like this before?" There was a general muttering as the assembled mechs examined the sarcophagus from various angles. One particularly old mech, his skin darker green than the others and covered in crude tattoos, pushed forward to get a better look. "I seen something like this once," he said slowly, his voice thoughtful. "Was on a dead world, way out past a big red nebula. The Yumis had left some big metal things behind, walking machines with dead Yumis inside. Dear
Boss man, he called them. Dread somethings. Dreadnoughts?
Dreadnoughts, Klobsnik corrected automatically, then paused as the implications sank in.
This is a dreadnought? A real one? Zog me. The boys are gonna be right chuffed when we get this working.
The assumption that they would get it working was never in doubt. The only question was how. The mechs began their examination in earnest, mapping out the sarcophagus's structure, identifying what looked like power couplings and weapon mounts, tracing lines of circuitry that glowed faintly even after 1,000 years of dormancy. What none of them realized, what none of them could have known, was that their probing and prodding and experimental prodding with power cables was having an effect. Deep within the sarcophagus, in the darkness where a warrior had slept for a millennium, something was beginning to stir. The Grey Knight's Dreadnought was waking up, and when he fully awakened, when his weapon systems came online and his psychic might returned, the Orks were going to discover that some treasures are better left buried. Initial contact. The Ork investigation. The mech workshop had taken on the atmosphere of a religious gathering, if Orks had religion, which they did not, but if they had, this would have been what it looked like. Dozens of mech boys crowded around the workbench, each offering suggestions that ranged from practical to absurd. The younger spanners were relegated to the outer circle, standing on boxes and scrap piles to get a better view, their eyes wide with the excitement of seeing something genuinely new. Klobsnik had appointed himself chief investigator, a decision nobody challenged because he was both the biggest mech present and the one with the most impressive collection of half-functional gadgets strapped to his person. He circled the sarcophagus slowly, occasionally stopping to tap a section of armor or peer closely at a particular symbol. "Right, here's what we know," he announced, his voice cutting through the excited chatter. "This is a dreadnought, which means there's a dead Yumi inside. Probably been dead for ages, which is a shame because if he was alive, we could fight him. But the good news is, this means there's loads of good gubbins we can loot. Weapons, power source, all that fancy armor platin." "How we gonna get inside?" one of the mechs asked. "That metal's proper tough. Shot it with a big shooter and it didn't even scratch." Klobsnik nodded sagely. "Yeah, the Yumis make good armor when they want to, but they also got to get inside it themselves, right? So there's got to be a way to open it, some kind of latch or button or something." This sparked a new wave of examination as the mechs searched for any kind of opening mechanism. They found several panels that looked promising, but all of them were sealed tight. One enthusiastic spanner tried prying at a seam with a crowbar, which resulted in the crowbar bending and the seam remaining stubbornly closed. "Maybe it needs power," suggested a mech who specialized in electrical systems. "Lots of Yumi tech won't work if it ain't got juice. We could try hooking it up to one of the generators." This was generally agreed to be a good idea, though there was immediate debate about which generator to use and how exactly to connect it. The Dreadnought had several obvious power ports, but they were designed for Imperial technology, which used different voltage standards and connection types than Ork equipment. This did not particularly concern the mechs, who were confident that if they just hooked up enough power cables, something would work. The largest generator in the camp was rolled over, a massive device that had started life as an Imperial Prometheum engine before being extensively modified by Ork hands. It wheezed and coughed as it was positioned next to the workbench, belching black smoke that made several Gretchen cough and scatter. Klobsnik personally oversaw the connection process, directing other mechs to attach cables to various ports on the sarcophagus. The cables were a motley collection, some stripped from Imperial vehicles, others clearly Ork-made, all of them questionable in terms of insulation and safety. When all the connections were in place, Klobsnik stepped back to admire his work. "Right," he said, grabbing the generator's activation lever. "Let's see what happens." He pulled the lever. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like thunder trapped in a bottle, power surged through the cables and into the Dreadnought's systems. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Lights that had been dark for 1,000 years flickered to life along the sarcophagus's surface. The symbols inscribed into the armor began to glow with a cold silver light that made the watching Orks squint and look away. Deep within the machine, something that sounded like a massive heart began to beat, each pulse sending a tremor through the workbench. "It's working!" shouted a young spanner, jumping up and down with excitement. But Klobsnik was not so sure. The power readings he was getting from his various jury-rigged sensors were odd, fluctuating wildly in ways that did not match any pattern he had seen before. And there was something else, something he could feel rather than measure. A pressure building in the air, a sense of something vast and powerful stirring from a long sleep. Boss?" one of the other mechs said nervously. "Is it supposed to be making that noise?" The noise in question was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than being heard through the ears. It was growing louder, accompanied by the sound of machinery coming online, servos activating, weapon systems powering up. The Dreadnought's armor plates, which had been motionless for so long, were beginning to shift, adjusting their position as if the machine was stretching after a long nap. "Maybe we should," Klobsnik started to say, but he never finished the sentence. The Dreadnought's optical sensors activated with a flash of brilliant light, twin beams of psychically charged illumination that swept across the workshop like the gaze of an angry god. Where the light touched, Orks flinched and covered their eyes, feeling a sensation they rarely experienced: fear. Not the healthy respect for danger that made them duck when big guns fired, but actual, primal fear, the kind that made even the bravest warrior want to run and hide. The sarcophagus was fully active now, its internal systems booting up one by one, running diagnostic checks on weapons that had not fired in a millennium, testing servos that had been motionless for longer than most civilizations endured. And somewhere deep within that metal shell, a consciousness was stirring, pulling itself out of dreams that had lasted for 1,000 years. Brother Ancient Aldrich of the Grey Knights was waking up, and the last thing he remembered was fighting demons. The confusion was immediate and profound. In his mind, Aldrich was still on that battlefield, still locked in combat with the forces of chaos that had torn reality apart on this world. The screams of dying Marines echoed in his ears. The stench of brimstone and corrupted flesh filled his nostrils. His hands, the power fist and psy-cannon that served him as hands now, remembered the weight of demon flesh as they tore and burned. But something was wrong. The sensory input did not match his memories. Where there should have been the roar of battle, he heard crude mechanical noises and the guttural sounds of something speaking. Where there should have been the psychic stench of demonic presence, he felt instead a different kind of wrongness. A greasy, alien psychic signature that he had encountered before but could not immediately place. His optical sensors, still calibrating after their long dormancy, provided only blurry, indistinct images. He could see shapes moving around him, large shapes, green shapes. The perspective was wrong too. He was lying down, or the sarcophagus was horizontal, which made no tactical sense. Had he been knocked over in battle? Was his chassis damaged? Aldrich attempted to activate his combat systems, to raise his weapons and defend himself, but his limbs felt sluggish, unresponsive. Power was flowing through his systems. He could feel that much, but it was wrong somehow. The voltage was fluctuating wildly, the flow uneven, as if his power couplings had been connected to some inferior source. Where am I? His voice, amplified by the Dreadnought's Vox speakers, emerged as a grinding roar of mechanical thunder overlaid with psychic resonance that made every orc in the workshop freeze in place. The mechs stared at the Dreadnought in shock. It was supposed to be a salvage job, a nice piece of tech to take apart and learn from. It was not supposed to wake up and start talking. "It's alive!" one of the younger spanners squeaked, stating the obvious with the kind of panicked clarity that comes from being genuinely surprised and frightened. Klobsnik's mind was racing. This changed everything. If the Dreadnought was still functional, if the warrior inside was still alive, then this was not just loot. This was a proper fight. And while looting was good, fighting was better. "Boss!" Klobsnik bellowed, calling for Gutgrinder. "Boss, you gotta see this! The dead Yumi Inda ain't dead after all!" Gutgrinder, who had been supervising the construction of a new war wagon on the other side of camp, came running, his massive feet shaking the ground with each step. He burst into the workshop with several of his biggest knobs in tow, ready for a fight. "What's all this racket?" he demanded, then stopped short as he saw the Dreadnought, now fully active and slowly attempting to right itself. Aldrich's systems were coming fully online now. His optical sensors had finished calibrating, and what they showed him made no sense. He was in some kind of workshop, surrounded by crude machinery and orcs. He was surrounded by orcs, dozens of them, all staring at him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to outright greed. Memory came flooding back in a disorienting rush. He had been fighting on this world, yes, but that had been how long ago? His internal chronometer was showing errors, the timestamp impossibly distant. 1,000 years. That could not be right. But his sensor logs did not lie, and when he accessed his last recorded mission timestamp, he found it was indeed dated a millennium in the past. He had been left here. Abandoned? No, that did not make sense. The Grey Knights never abandoned their own. He must have been buried, written off as destroyed or irretrievable. The battle had been desperate. He remembered that much. A greater demon of terrible power, summoned by cultists who had turned an entire hive city to their dark gods. The fighting had been fierce, the casualties high, and now he was here, in an orc camp, apparently having been dug up and mistaken for salvage. The situation called for careful assessment. Aldrich was a warrior, trained to fight the most terrible enemies the galaxy could produce, but he was also a strategist. He was outnumbered, surrounded, and his systems were not at full power, thanks to whatever barbaric power source the orcs had connected him to. A direct assault might succeed, but it would be costly, and there were tactical considerations to evaluate first. "Orcs," he said, his voice modulated to a more reasonable volume, but still carrying the weight of authority and psychic presence that was natural to a Grey Knight. "You will release me immediately and provide transportation to the nearest Imperial facility. Failure to comply will result in your immediate destruction. The declaration was met with confused silence from the Orks, most of whom were still trying to process the fact that their loot had started talking. Then Gutgrinder began to laugh, a deep, booming sound that shook the workshop's walls. "You hear that, boys? The Tin Can wants us to let him go." The warboss stepped closer, his massive frame still dwarfed by the Dreadnought, even though Aldrich was lying horizontally. "And what if we don't, eh? What are you going to do about it?" Aldrich assessed his options. His weapons were powered but not fully charged. His servos were functional, but operating at reduced efficiency, and he was in a terrible tactical position, lying on his back on a workbench. But he had one advantage the Orks did not expect. He was a psyker. Reaching into the warp required no weapons, no physical movement, only will and training. Aldrich's psychic might, dormant for so long, awakened like a sleeping dragon opening its eyes. The Aegis, the psychic defenses inscribed into every centimeter of his armor, flared to life with a brilliance that made the workshop's dim lighting seem pathetically inadequate by comparison. The effect on the Orks was immediate. Those closest to the Dreadnought cried, "Out!" and staggered back, their crude minds unable to process the psychic pressure suddenly bearing down on them. It was like standing too close to a bonfire, a heat that burned not flesh, but something deeper, something in the soul that even Orks possessed in their own crude way. "I am brother ancient Aldrich of the Grey Knights," the Dreadnought said, and now his voice carried harmonics of power that made the very air shimmer. "I have walked the gardens of Nurgle and emerged unscathed. I have banished greater demons whose names would drive mortal minds to madness. I have broken the will of demon princes and cast them screaming back into the warp." The Dreadnought's massive frame was shifting now, servos grinding, as Aldrich attempted to right himself despite the awkward position and the cables still attached to his power ports. "You have made a grave error in disturbing my rest. Your only chance of survival is to comply with my demands immediately." Gutgrinder, to his credit, did not back down, though several of his boys were edging toward the workshop entrance. "That's real impressive, that is. But here's the thing. Tin Can, we got you surrounded, we got the numbers, and if you start something, we're gonna finish it, see?" It was a standoff, the kind that could go either way depending on who blinked first. Aldrich was calculating his chances of fighting his way out. The Orks were calculating their chances of taking him down without too many casualties. And in the back of everyone's mind was the same question: what happens next? The answer, as it turned out, would be violent, chaotic, and would provide both sides with exactly the kind of entertainment they had been looking for, though not in the way anyone expected. The awakening battle, when silver meets green. What broke the standoff was not a deliberate decision by either party, but rather an accident born of Ork enthusiasm and poor safety practices. One of the younger spanners, emboldened by Gutgrinder's defiance and, wanting to prove his courage, decided that the best way to show this uppity Yumi who was boss would be to shoot him. It was simple Ork logic. If something was causing problems, you shot it until it stopped causing problems. The spanner raised his shooter, a crude weapon that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different guns and held together with optimism and wire, and fired a burst at the Dreadnought's head. The shots went wide, as Ork shooting often did, but one round clipped the edge of Aldrich's optical sensor housing with a spark and a clang. For Aldrich, this decided the matter. He had offered them a chance to surrender peacefully. They had responded with violence. The Grey Knights had extensive protocols for dealing with Xenos threats, and all of them began with the same simple principle: purge the unclean with fire and steel. The Dreadnought moved with a speed that shocked the watching Orks. One moment he was lying prone on the workbench, seemingly helpless and restrained by cables. The next, he had ripped free of his power connections with a shower of sparks and was rising to his full height, a towering figure of blessed silver and ancient fury. His Psy-Cannon, which had been folded against his chassis for storage, deployed with a whine of servos, and the distinctive hum of psychically charged capacitors reaching full power. The weapon was a work of art, a precision instrument designed to fire bolts that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, able to tear apart both physical matter and spiritual essence with equal ease. He aimed at the ceiling and fired a single shot, a demonstration of power meant to make the Orks reconsider their position. The bolt of psychically charged energy punched through the workshop's roof like it was paper, leaving a hole through which the grey sky was visible. Fragments of metal and rockcrete rained down on the assembled Orks. Last chance! Aldrich's voice carried the full weight of his authority now, amplified by psychic might that made the air itself vibrate with barely contained power. Surrender or die. Gutgrinder's response was to pull out his own weapon, a massive slugger that looked like someone had welded a cannon to a pistol grip, and fire back at the Dreadnought. Wah! He bellowed, the ancient Ork battle cry that signaled the beginning of violence and chaos. The workshop exploded into combat. Orks, who moments ago had been curious spectators, suddenly became a green tide of violence, each one eager to get in a good hit on this challenging opponent. They swarmed toward the Dreadnought from all sides, shooting, chopping, and in one memorable case, throwing a wrench that bounced off Aldrich's armored knee with a sad clang. Aldrich's response was methodical and devastating. His assault cannon, mounted on his left arm, spun up to firing speed with a sound like a rising scream. When it fired, the noise was deafening, a continuous roar of explosive rounds that tore through Ork flesh and crude armor with equal ease. His targeting systems, ancient and sophisticated beyond anything the Orks could comprehend, painted targets faster than he could acquire them. Each burst of fire was precise, conserving ammunition while maximizing casualties. But the Orks were not deterred by casualties. If anything, the violence seemed to excite them, to drive them into a frenzy. The vague field, that invisible psychic energy that bound all greenskins together, was strengthening with each moment of combat. It fed on their excitement, their bloodlust, their absolute certainty that this was the best fight they had ever been in. Klobsnik, the big mech, had retreated to a safe distance and was watching with professional interest. "That's some proper good shooting," he observed to a knob who had taken cover behind the same pile of scrap. "See how it don't waste ammo? Real efficient like. We could learn something from that." The knob grunted agreement, then remembered he was supposed to be fighting and charged back into the fray with a roar. Aldrich was adapting to the chaotic nature of Ork combat, something that required a different tactical approach than fighting demons. Demons were predictable in their way, bound by the nature of the entities that created them. Orks were pure chaos, attacking from all angles with no apparent coordination, but somehow managing to create a kind of emergent strategy through sheer numbers and enthusiasm. His nemesis Doomfist, the massive power weapon that served as his right arm, swept through the press of bodies like a farmer scything wheat. The psychic energy crackling along its surface was anathema to warp entities, which meant it was somewhat wasted on Orks, but it still hit with enough force to send greenskins flying through the air like green missiles. One unfortunate Ork was sent flying through the workshop wall, creating a new exit that several of his companions immediately used. The battle had spilled outside, now, drawing more Orks from across the camp. What had started as a workshop full of curious mech boys had evolved into a full-scale engagement, with hundreds of Orks converging on the source of all this exciting violence. They came with shooters and choppers, with crude bombs and looted weapons, with enthusiasm and a complete disregard for their own safety. Aldrich found himself in the middle of a green hurricane. Bullets pinged off his armor from all directions. Crude rockets exploded around him, their fragments adding to the chaos, but doing minimal damage to his blessed ceramite. An Ork with a power claw managed to climb onto his back and started trying to pry open his armor plates, a futile effort that Aldrich ended by spinning rapidly and dislodging his passenger with centrifugal force. But the Grey Knight was beginning to notice something strange. His psychic senses, trained to detect the smallest trace of chaos corruption or warp taint, were picking up something from the Orks. It was not chaos, not in any traditional sense, but it was definitely psychic energy. The wag field was becoming visible to his third eye, a roiling green tide of raw emotion and belief that surrounded the Orks like an aura. More concerningly, it seemed to be affecting his weapons. His assault cannon, which should have jammed by now based on the amount of sustained fire, was functioning perfectly. His servo motors, which had been sluggish when he first awakened, were responding with increasing smoothness, and his ammunition, which by all calculations should be running dangerously low, seemed to be lasting far longer than it should. The realization hit him with uncomfortable clarity. The wag field was affecting him. The Orks believed he should be a proper fight, believed his weapons should work properly, and their collective psychic belief was making it so. He was benefiting from the same reality-warping energy that made Ork technology function, and the implications of this were troubling in ways he did not have time to contemplate during active combat. A knob, bigger than the other Orks and covered in armor plates looted from at least 3 different sources, charged at him with a massive chopper raised high. The weapon, which looked like it had been made by welding 6 regular Ork axes together and adding a motor for good measure, came down with enough force to dent even a Dreadnought's armor. Aldrich caught the blow with his Doom Fist, the power field around his weapon meeting the crude energy field around the chopper in a shower of sparks and a sound like a thunderclap. For a moment, Ork and Dreadnought were locked in a contest of pure strength, servos straining against muscle, blessed technology against crude belief. The knob grinned, showing a mouth full of metal teeth. "This is proper good, this is," he shouted over the noise of battle. "Been too long since we had a real scrap." Aldrich did not respond verbally. Instead, he channeled psychic energy through his Doom Fist, the same technique he had used countless times against demon princes and possessed traitors. The power flared, brilliant and terrible, and the knob was thrown backward with such force that he crashed through 2 of his fellows and left a crater in the ground where he finally stopped. But the knob was already getting back up, laughing. This was the nature of Orks. They were tough in ways that defied logic, able to shrug off wounds that should have killed them, their bodies knitting back together with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The same collective psychic field that made their weapons work made them believe they could survive anything, and that belief kept them going long past the point where other races would have collapsed. Aldrich was conducting a fighting retreat now, moving toward the edge of the Ork camp and what looked like open ground beyond. He needed space to maneuver, room to use his superior firepower without being surrounded. The Orks, sensing their prey attempting to escape, redoubled their efforts, pressing in from all sides with renewed enthusiasm. Gutgrinder had climbed into a crude vehicle, a thing that might charitably be called a war wagon, but looked more like someone had strapped guns to a shipping container and added wheels as an afterthought. From this mobile command post, he was directing the battle with surprising tactical acumen, sending squads to flank the Dreadnought while maintaining pressure from the front. "Don't let the tin can get away, boys!" he roared. "That's our loot, and we ain't sharing it with nobody." A squad of looters, Orks armed with an eclectic collection of heavy weapons looted from various enemies, set up a firing position on a nearby hill and began pouring fire into Aldrich's position. The barrage was wildly inaccurate, as Ork shooting tended to be, but the sheer volume of fire meant that some shots were bound to hit. Several rounds punched into the Dreadnought's armor, cratering the blessed, ceramite but not penetrating to the vital systems beneath. Aldrich returned fire with his assault cannon, the stream of explosive rounds walking across the looters' position with devastating effect. Orks scattered, some blown apart by direct hits, others diving for cover and immediately popping back up to resume shooting, because they had not come all this way to hide. The battle had become a running engagement, with Aldrich moving steadily toward the camp's perimeter, while the Orks pursued with the kind of single-minded determination that would have been admirable in a more civilized species. The ground was littered with Ork bodies, green blood staining the dirt, but there seemed to be an endless supply of replacements. For every Ork that fell, 2 more appeared, drawn by the sound of fighting and the promise of a good scrap. Aldrich's tactical situation was deteriorating. His ammunition, despite the strange effects of the WH40K field, was genuinely running low now. His armor had taken damage, nothing critical yet, but accumulating in ways that concerned his combat protocols. And most worryingly, he was beginning to detect signs of mechanical stress in his servos, the 1,000-year sleep having left them less resilient than they should be. But he was still a Grey Knight, still one of the Emperor's finest warriors, and he had faced worse odds against more terrible enemies. He activated his remaining psychic reserves, channeling power into a hammerhand blessing that wreathed his weapons in silver fire. When his Doomfist struck now, it did not merely kill, it annihilated, reducing Orks to their component molecules with each blow. The Orks, far from being intimidated by this display of power, were ecstatic. This was exactly the kind of challenge they had been hoping for. A proper enemy who fought with skill and ferocity, who did not break or flee, but stood and delivered violence with the kind of enthusiasm they could respect. "That's it, Tin Can," Gut Grinder bellowed from his wagon.
"Show us what you got. Make this a fight worth remembering."
And Aldrich, despite his situation, despite the absurdity of fighting Orks when he should be hunting demons, despite the fact that he had woken from a millennium of sleep, only to immediately find himself in combat with the galaxy's most persistently irritating Xenos race, found himself responding to the challenge. He would show them what a Grey Knight could do. And when he was done, the surviving Orks would have a story to tell, a legend of the day they found a sleeping giant and learned that some things, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The battle raged on, silver and green locked in a dance of violence that neither side was willing to end. It was not elegant. It was not tactical genius. It was simply war in its purest form, two forces colliding with maximum violence and seeing who would still be standing when the dust settled. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And, sometimes, that war is exactly as chaotic and absurd as it sounds. Psychic warfare. When warp meets whoa. As the battle progressed from minutes into hours, something unusual began to happen. Aldrich, his psychic senses attuned to the subtlest fluctuations in the warp, became increasingly aware of the strange nature of the energy surrounding him. The WH40K field was not chaos. It lacked the malevolent sentience, the corrupting taint that characterized demonic presence. But it was definitely warp energy, psychic power of a type he had never encountered in quite this configuration. The field was like a living thing, a vast collective unconsciousness generated by thousands of Ork minds, all focused on the same simple desire: a good fight. It did not think in any conventional sense, did not plan or strategize, but it responded to the Orks' needs with an almost instinctive intelligence. When they believed something should work a certain way, the field nudged reality to make it so. When they expected their weapons to function, their vehicles to run, their bodies to withstand punishment, the WH40K field provided just enough psychic reinforcement to turn belief into reality. For Aldrich, trained to resist and repel psychic influences, this presented a unique challenge. His aegis, the network of wards and blessings that protected him from chaos corruption, was designed to reject warp energy. But the WH40K field was not trying to corrupt him or breach his defenses. It simply was. A background radiation of psychic energy that permeated everything in the Ork camp like an invisible fog. And strangest of all, it seemed to be affecting him in beneficial ways. His weapons were firing with greater reliability than they should. His servos, which had been sluggish from millennium of disuse, were responding with increasing smoothness. Even his ammunition situation, which should have been critical by now, seemed to be holding out far longer than his tactical computers predicted. The realization was both fascinating and disturbing. The Orks believed he should be a proper challenge, believed that a fight against an ancient war machine should be difficult and exciting. and their collective belief was subtly adjusting reality to make him exactly as dangerous as they expected him to be. Aldrich decided to test this hypothesis. He reached into the warp, channeling psychic energy not for combat, but for observation, extending his consciousness to map the contours of the WH40K field around him. What he found was unlike anything in the Grey Knight's extensive archives of psychic phenomena. The field was not uniform. It had currents and eddies, concentrations of power around particularly enthusiastic groups of orcs, weak spots where lone greenskins fought without nearby support. It responded to emotion, growing stronger as the orcs became more excited, feeding on their joy in combat and their absolute certainty that they were having the time of their lives. More interestingly, the field was remarkably stable. Unlike chaos energy, which was inherently volatile and corrupting, the GRG field was almost orderly in its chaos. It did not seek to change or corrupt, only to enable. It was tool rather than master, a psychic amplifier that made the orcs' crude technology and simple tactics far more effective than they had any right to be. Aldrich filed this information away for later analysis. The Grey Knights would want to know about this, assuming he survived to report it. The idea that Xenos could generate stable warp energy without corruption was significant, possibly even revolutionary in its implications for understanding psychic phenomena. But such contemplation would have to wait. Right now, he had more immediate concerns. A mob of orcs armed with rockets had set up a firing position on a nearby ridge, and their first volley was already incoming. Aldrich's targeting systems painted the rockets' trajectories in his optical display, calculating impact points and damage potential with mechanical precision. Most would miss, but 3 were on target for his central chassis, where his sarcophagus was housed. He could have tried to dodge, but dreadnoughts were not built for agility. Instead, he raised his Doomfist and channeled psychic energy into a barrier, a translucent shield of warp energy that materialized in front of him just as the rockets struck. 2 detonated against the barrier, their explosive force dissipating harmlessly into the warp. The third punched through, but its force was spent, and it bounced off his armor without penetrating. The orcs on the ridge hooted with disappointment at their failure, then immediately began reloading for another try. This, Aldrich realized, was perhaps the most frustrating aspect of fighting orcs. They did not learn from failure in any conventional sense. Each setback was just an opportunity to try again, possibly with more enthusiasm and less caution. He turned his assault cannon on the ridge and fired a sustained burst, scattering the orcs and forcing them to abandon their position. But even as they fled, they were laughing, already planning their next attack, completely undaunted by the fact that they had just been comprehensively defeated. Gut Grinder, still commanding from his war wagon, had adapted his tactics to account for Aldrich's capabilities. Rather than sending his boys in mindless waves, he was using them more strategically, probing for weaknesses, keeping the Dreadnought constantly engaged from multiple directions to prevent him from focusing fire on any single threat. It was, Aldrich had to admit, reasonably effective tactics for orcs. Gut Grinder was no tactical genius by Imperial standards, but he understood his troops and how to use them. He knew that orcs could absorb casualties that would break other armies, knew that their enthusiasm made them ideal for sacrificial assaults that would tie up the enemy while he maneuvered his heavier weapons into position. But Gut Grinder had not faced a Grey Knight before. He did not know that Aldrich was reading the psychic currents of the battle, using his enhanced senses to predict where attacks would come from before they even began. He did not know that every moment of combat was teaching Aldrich more about how the WH40K field worked, giving him insight into how to counter it. Aldrich focused his psychic might and cast out a wave of purifying energy, the kind of blessing he might use against demonic hordes. The silver light washed across the battlefield, and where it touched orcs, they faltered, not because it harmed them directly. They were not creatures of the warp like demons, but because it disrupted the WH40K field, momentarily breaking the psychic connection that bound them together. The effect was subtle, but noticeable. Ork weapons that had been firing with unusual reliability suddenly jammed. War buggies that had been running smoothly, despite obvious mechanical defects, suddenly sputtered and stalled. The greenskins themselves felt a moment of uncertainty, a brief flicker of doubt that was utterly alien to their usual absolute confidence. But the effect did not last. The WH40K field was too strong, fed by too many Orks, to be disrupted by a single psychic attack. Within moments, it had reasserted itself, flowing back like a tide returning to shore, and the Orks were back to their usual enthusiastic violence. Klobsnik, watching from his safe observation point, had noticed the effect. "Did you see that?" he asked nobody in particular. "Dartin Khan did something weird, made all our stuff go wonky for a bit. Some kinda zappy thing." The big mech's crude understanding was actually not far from the truth. He might not understand the mechanics of psychic warfare, but he recognized an attack when he saw one, even one that operated on principles completely outside his experience. "We need to get closer," Klobsnik decided. "Can't let Datin can keep zapping us like that. We gotta get in close where he can't use his fancy magic tricks." This decision was communicated to Gutgrinder through the sophisticated Ork communication method of shouting really loud and pointing a lot. The war boss, who had been thinking along similar lines, immediately ordered a general advance. Hundreds of Orks surged forward, abandoning any pretense of cover or tactics, simply charging straight at the Dreadnought with the kind of reckless courage that made them simultaneously the galaxy's most dangerous and most predictable enemy. Aldrich prepared for the assault. His ammunition was finally running critically low. Even the WH40K field's reality-bending effects could not conjure bullets from nothing. His power reserves were also dropping, the strain of sustained combat and psychic warfare taking its toll on systems that had not been properly maintained in a millennium. But he was still dangerous, still lethal, still a Grey Knight, and if the Orks wanted to get close, he would show them why dreadnoughts were equipped with close combat weapons. His nemesis Doomfist crackled with psychic energy as the first wave of Orks crashed into him. He swung the massive weapon in wide arcs, each blow sending greenskins flying like green bowling pins. His assault cannon, conserving its last magazine, fired short bursts into the thickest concentrations of enemies, each round making maximum use of the explosive potential. The battle had devolved into a melee brawl, exactly the kind of fight Orks loved most. They swarmed over the Dreadnought like angry green ants, climbing on his legs, hanging from his arms, trying to pry open his armor with their bare hands or with crude tools. Some had brought chains and were attempting to tie him down. Others were simply hitting him with whatever they had handy, acting on the sound Ork principle that if you hit something hard enough and often enough, eventually it will break. Aldrich spun and thrashed, trying to shake off his attackers. But for every Ork he dislodged, 2 more took their place. He was beginning to understand how it felt to be swarmed by demons, an experience he had inflicted on many enemies, but rarely experienced himself. Then, he felt something that made his psychic senses scream, warning, power building in the warp, focused and directed with surprising precision. His optical sensors swiveled to locate the source and found it immediately. Klobsnik had built something, a crude device that looked like someone had mounted a satellite dish on an artillery piece and decorated it with enough wires and crystals to suggest it was meant to channel psychic energy. "Let's see how you like this, Tin Can," the big mech shouted, throwing a lever on his contraption. The device hummed, sputtered, sparked ominously, then suddenly discharged a massive bolt of raw WH40K energy directly at Aldrich. The psychic blast was unlike anything the Grey Knight had encountered. Not chaos, not any form of warp energy he recognized, but something uniquely Orkish. Belief and violence condensed into a projectile and fired with complete disregard for safety or precision. Aldrich's aegis absorbed the worst of it, the wards inscribed into his armor flaring brilliant silver as they rejected the alien psychic energy. But some of it got through, enough to send a shockwave through his systems that caused several warning runes to light up on his internal displays. The Dreadnought staggered, momentarily disoriented by the psychic assault. This was all the opening the Orks needed. Chains were thrown around his legs and pulled tight by dozens of greenskins, working in crude coordination. A knob with a power claw climbed onto his back and started attacking the power coupling where his sarcophagus connected to his chassis. For the first time since awakening, Aldrich felt something he had not experienced in 1,000 years, genuine concern that he might actually lose this fight. The turning point. Fury unleashed. The chains binding Aldrich's legs were crude but effective. Dozens of Orks pulling in different directions with their considerable strength. The knob on his back was making alarming progress with his power claw, the crude energy field around the weapon actually managing to score the blessed armor that protected Aldrich's sarcophagus. Warning runes were proliferating in his optical display, systems reporting damage and stress beyond acceptable parameters. But brother Ancient Aldrich had not survived 1,000 years of service to the Grey Knights by giving up when things looked bad. He had fought greater demons in single combat. He had stood alone against demon hordes when his battle brothers fell around him. He had banished entities whose mere names could drive mortals mad. A few hundred Orks, however enthusiastic, were not going to be his end. He reached deep into the warp, deeper than he had dared since awakening, pulling on reserves of psychic might that he had been conserving for a truly desperate moment. This qualified. Power flooded through him, not the careful, controlled flow he had been using, but a torrent of psychic energy that made the aegis inscribed on his armor blaze like a captured star. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The chains binding him shattered, not cut, but simply unmade, their molecular bonds disrupted by psychic force. Orks holding the chains were thrown backward, some actually catching fire from the psychic backlash. The knob on his back screamed and leapt away, the metal of his power claw glowing red-hot from proximity to so much concentrated psychic energy. Aldrich stood to his full height, and for a moment, just a moment, every Ork on the battlefield stopped and stared. Because what they saw was not merely a war machine, but something that transcended the mechanical. The Dreadnought was wreathed in silver fire, psychic energy made visible, pouring off his armor like water from a fountain. His optical sensors blazed with light that hurt to look at directly. The very air around him shimmered with power. "Behold the Emperor's wrath!" Aldrich's voice carried across the battlefield, amplified by psychic force until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have awakened one of his chosen, disturbed the rest of a warrior who has fought since before your grandfather's grandfathers first drew breath. For this transgression, you will learn the true meaning of fury." In the Grey Knight's fortress monastery on Titan, there are rituals of power that only the most skilled and experienced knights dare attempt. One such ritual is the Rite of Cleansing, a psychic working designed to purify entire battlefields of demonic taint. It requires immense focus, perfect control, and usually the combined efforts of several battle brothers working in concert. Aldrich, in his current state, was not concerned with perfect control. He channeled the ritual through his Dreadnought's enhanced psychic, Matrix, allowing the machine's systems to compensate for the lack of precision with raw power. The result was not subtle. A wave of purifying energy exploded outward from the Dreadnought, a sphere of silver light expanding at the speed of thought. Where it touched Orks, they did not die. The ritual was designed for demons, not living creatures. But they certainly did not enjoy the experience. The psychic pressure was overwhelming, forcing them to their knees, making their crude nervous systems scream with signals they had no context to understand. The WAG field, that invisible psychic energy that had been sustaining the Ork attack, shattered like glass under the assault. Weapons that had been working perfectly suddenly remembered that they were held together with wire and hope, and acted accordingly, jamming or exploding or simply falling apart. Vehicles that had been running on enthusiasm and the collective belief that they should work, stalled out as that belief was forcibly disrupted. Even Gutgrinder, who had been preparing another wave of attacks, found himself momentarily unable to act, his mind reeling from the psychic onslaught. It felt like someone was pressing on his brain, not painfully but insistently, a pressure that made thinking difficult and moving even more so. Aldrich did not waste the opportunity. His assault cannon, down to its last magazine, roared to life one final time. He fired with perfect precision, each burst targeting either a weapon emplacement or a particularly large concentration of orcs. His Doomfist swung in great arcs, clearing space around him, sending broken orcs flying through the air. Klobsnik's improvised psychic weapon, that crude attempt at capturing the WH field's power, exploded spectacularly as the purifying energy reached it. The big mech dove for cover as his creation turned into a ball of green-tinted fire, taking several of his assistants with it, in a blast that flattened everything within 20 meters. The battle, which moments ago had been going badly for Aldrich, was suddenly reversing. The orcs were in disarray, their usual coordination broken by the disruption of the WH field. Without that invisible psychic support, they were just a mob of confused greenskins, still dangerous, but no longer the overwhelming threat they had been. But orcs, to their credit, do not stay discouraged for long. Gutgrinder, shaking off the psychic pressure through sheer force of will, bellowed at his boys to get back in the fight. The WH field, disrupted but not destroyed, began to reassert itself as the orcs' natural resilience and enthusiasm reasserted themselves. "Is that all you got, Tin Can?" Gutgrinder roared, his voice carrying despite the chaos. "We've had bigger frights from a squig stampede. Come on, boys. He's just one Yumi in a can. There's loads of us. Wah!" The battle cry was taken up by hundreds of orc throats, a primal sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in their genetic programming. The WH field surged back to life, fed by renewed enthusiasm and the orcs' absolute refusal to accept that they might be losing. Aldrich felt the shift immediately. The psychic pressure he had been exerting, which had been pushing the orcs back, was now meeting resistance. The WH field was adapting, learning, growing stronger specifically to counter his psychic assault. It was like pushing against a tide. He could make progress, but the effort required was enormous and the gains temporary. This was, he realized, the fundamental difference between fighting demons and fighting orcs. Demons were powerful, but brittle. Sufficient psychic force could banish them back to the warp, destroy their connection to reality. Orcs were the opposite, crude and simple, but remarkably resilient. They did not break under psychic assault. They adapted and came back stronger. His ammunition finally ran dry, the assault cannon's last round fired into the face of a charging knob. The Yasir weapon clicked empty, and Aldrich knew he would not be getting any more ammunition from the WH field's reality-bending effects. That particular miracle had limits, and he had found them. But he still had his Doomfist, he still had his psychic powers, and he still had the determination that had seen him through a millennium of service. If the orcs wanted a close-quarters brawl, he would give them one they would never forget. The next phase of the battle was pure, brutal melee combat. Aldrich waded into the orc horde, his Doomfist rising and falling with mechanical precision, each blow enhanced by psychic might that made it supernaturally lethal. Orcs that got too close found themselves crushed beneath his massive feet, the Dreadnought's sheer mass and strength making him a walking fortress of destruction. The orcs, for their part, were having the time of their lives. This was exactly the kind of fight they loved best, up close and personal, where you could look your enemy in the pulsant eye or optical sensor and see the light go out when you hit them just right. The fact that they were taking heavy casualties only made it better, because it meant the enemy was a proper challenge. Gutgrinder had dismounted from his war wagon and was now in the thick of combat himself, his massive chopper swinging at Aldrich's legs in an attempt to knock the Dreadnought over. The war boss was covered in scars from a lifetime of fighting, each one a story, each one proof that he was tough enough to survive what had killed lesser orcs. He was grinning as he fought, his yellow eyes alight with the joy of combat. "This is more like it," he laughed, dodging a swipe from the Doomfist that would have taken his head off. A proper scrap with a proper enemy. The boys are going to be talking about this for years. Aldrich, who did not share the Ork enthusiasm for unnecessary violence, nonetheless had to respect their courage. They were outmatched, outgunned, and losing the fight by any objective measure. But they kept coming, kept fighting, kept believing that if they just tried hard enough, they could win. It was, in its own crude way, admirable, but admiration did not change tactical reality. Aldrich was winning this battle. The Ork numbers were dwindling, their casualties mounting beyond the point where any sane army would have retreated. His armor was scored and dented but still functional, his systems damaged but operational, his power reserves low but not yet critical. The question now was not whether he would win, but what would happen after. Aftermath and exodus. The battle's end came not with a dramatic final blow, but with a gradual realization among the surviving Orks that continuing to fight was not going to get them what they wanted. They had been fighting for hours. The sun had moved across the sky from mid-morning to late afternoon, and while they were still enthusiastic about combat, even Orks eventually had to acknowledge practical realities. Gutgrinder, bleeding, from a dozen wounds and missing most of his left arm below the elbow, courtesy of a precise strike from the Doomfist, finally called for a halt. All right, he bellowed, staggering back from the Dreadnought's reach. Enough! We're done! The surviving Orks, perhaps 300 out of the 1,000 or more who had participated in the battle, slowly disengaged, backing away from Aldrich, but keeping their weapons ready in case the Yumi decided to keep fighting. The battlefield was littered with Ork bodies, green blood staining the ground, crude weapons scattered like fallen leaves. Aldrich stood motionless, his optical sensors tracking every Ork, his systems on high alert for any sign that this was a trick. His ammunition was completely exhausted, his power reserves dangerously low, and multiple systems were showing critical damage warnings. If the Orks decided to resume the attack, he would be hard-pressed to survive. But the Orks did not resume the attack. Instead, Gutgrinder sat down heavily on a piece of rubble and looked up at the Dreadnought with an expression that might have been respect. "You fight good, Tin Can," the war boss said, his voice carrying genuine admiration. "Real good. Best scrap we've had in ages." He paused, then grinned, showing metal teeth. "But you're still stuck here, ain't you? No ammo, probably low on juice, surrounded by us. So, how about we make a deal?" Aldrich was surprised enough by this suggestion to actually respond. "What kind of deal would I make with Xenos?" "A practical one," Gutgrinder replied, showing surprising diplomatic skills for an Ork war boss. "You need to get off this rock, get back to your Yumi mates. We don't need nothing really, but it'd be nice if you didn't keep killing my boys. So here's what I'm thinking. We don't kill you, you don't kill us, and we help you get off-world. In return, you tell your Yumi bosses that Gutgrinder's wag is not to be messed with. Deal?" It was, Aldrich had to admit, not the worst offer he had ever received. He was in no position to fight his way out of the Ork camp, not with his current damage and depleted resources. And there was strategic value in allowing the Orks to survive. They would carry the tale of this battle back to their kind, spreading word that Grey Knight's dreadnoughts were not to be trifled with. More importantly, Aldrich had a duty to return to the chapter. 1,000 years of knowledge and experience resided in his memory banks, tactical data about battles fought and enemies defeated. That information needed to be preserved, added to the Grey Knight's collective wisdom. His pride was not worth losing that. "Agreed," he said, the word coming out with great reluctance. "On one condition. You will provide me with detailed information about this world's location and the nearest Imperial outpost." Gutgrinder waved dismissively. Yeah, Klobsnik can find that out. We looted a bunch of Yumi nav charts from a ship we smashed up a while back. Never figured out what they meant, but you probably can." And so, in one of the more unusual truces in Imperial history, a Grey Knight's dreadnought and an Ork war boss came to an agreement. The surviving Orks, under Gutgrinder's direction, set about repairing Aldrich's damaged systems using whatever materials they had available. The repairs were crude, involving a lot of welding and improvised patches, but they were effective enough to get his mobility back to acceptable levels. Klobsnik, despite the loss of his psychic weapon, was almost gleeful at being given access to the Dreadnought's systems. He poked and prodded with the enthusiasm of a child with a new toy, making observations that were surprisingly insightful despite being couched in crude Ork terminology. "See, the problem with you Yumis," the big mech explained as he welded a patch over a damaged servo, "is you make everything too complicated. All desi wires and chips and whatnot. An Ork would just have a big lever that says go and a Nuva lever that says shoot. Much simpler." "Simplicity has its place," Aldrich acknowledged, "but so does reliability and precision." "Yeah, but where's the fun in that?" Klobsnik countered, missing the point entirely. Over the next few hours, while repairs progressed, Aldrich used his communication systems to attempt contact with the Grey Knights. The 1,000-year gap meant all his authorization codes were hopelessly out of date, but he was able to access Imperial broadcast frequencies and eventually made contact with a Navy patrol operating in a nearby system. The confusion on the other end of the line when he identified himself as a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, who had been missing for a millennium, was palpable. The naval officer, a lieutenant who clearly had not been trained for this situation, stammered through several attempts at protocol before finally just asking Aldrich to wait while they contacted higher authorities. 2 days later, a Grey Knight's strike cruiser entered the system. The ship's commander, Brother Captain Aurelian, was understandably skeptical about the reports of a dreadnought who had been missing for 10 centuries, suddenly calling for pickup from an Ork-controlled world. Such situations tended to be traps or chaos corruption, and the Grey Knights did not take chances with either. The initial contact between the Grey Knights and the Ork camp was tense, to put it mildly. A full strike team deployed to the surface, prepared for combat, weapons armed, and psychic powers ready. They found Aldrich standing in the middle of the Ork camp, his armor covered in crude Ork repairs, surrounded by greenskins, who seemed more curious than hostile. Brother Captain Aurelian approached with extreme caution, his storm bolter trained on the nearest Orks, his mind reaching out with psychic senses to detect any taint or corruption. What he found was nothing. No demon presence, no chaos corruption, just Orks being Orks, and a very old, very tired dreadnought who wanted to go home. "Brother Ancient," Aurelian said, his tone formal but carrying an undercurrent of relief. "You are intact." "Physically damaged, but functionally operational," Aldrich replied. "My sarcophagus and consciousness are uncorrupted. I have been in stasis for approximately 1,000 years and was awakened accidentally by these Xenos. And they did not destroy you." Aurelian's confusion was evident. "They tried," Aldrich said dryly. "I convinced them it was a poor tactical decision. We came to an arrangement." The explanation of what had happened took some time, and Aurelian's expression grew increasingly incredulous as the story progressed. The idea of a Grey Knight's dreadnought making a temporary truce with Orks was so far outside standard protocols that there simply was no procedure for it. Gutgrinder, watching the exchange from a safe distance, called out, "Oi! Tell your boss that we kept our end of the deal. Tin cans all fixed up and ready to go. So we're square, yeah?" Aurelian looked like he wanted to purge the entire camp on principle, but Aldrich's presence complicated that. The brother captain finally settled for a curt nod in Gutgrinder's direction, then turned his attention back to Aldrich. "Can you walk to the extraction point?" "Affirmative. My systems are crude but functional." The extraction was carried out with the entire Grey Knight strike team, maintaining a defensive perimeter, weapons trained on the Orks who watched with interest but did not interfere. Klobsnik could be heard explaining to other mechs about how the Yumi's teleportation technology worked, his explanations being wildly inaccurate but delivered with complete confidence. As Aldrich was loaded into the strike cruiser's docking bay, he took one last look at the Ork camp through his optical sensors. Gutgrinder was already organizing his remaining boys, planning their next fight. The war boss caught Aldrich's gaze and raised his remaining arm in what might have been a salute, or might have been a rude gesture. With Orks, it was hard to tell. The strike cruiser broke orbit and translated into the warp, carrying Aldrich back to Titan, back to the chapter that had thought him lost forever. The debriefing would be extensive, the questions endless, the examination of his experiences thorough. But for now, as his systems finally powered down into a maintenance mode that was as close to rest as a Dreadnought could achieve, Aldrich reflected on the strange nature of the galaxy. He had spent 1,000 years fighting demons, dedicated his existence to battling the most terrible enemies humanity faced. And yet it was Orks, the crude, simple, frustratingly resilient greenskins, who had found him after all that time. The universe, he decided, had a sense of humor. A dark, twisted, occasionally incomprehensible sense of humor, but a sense of humor nonetheless. Broader implications and analysis. The encounter between Brother Ancient Aldrich and Gutgrinder's wow would have repercussions far beyond that single battlefield. When Aldrich finally reached Titan and underwent the extensive debriefing process, his report on the WH40K's interaction with his psychic powers generated immediate interest among the Grey Knight's leadership. The phenomenon he described, a stable psychic field generated by Xenos that could affect reality without chaos corruption, was something the chapter's archives had references to but little hard data about. Most encounters with Orks were straightforward combat engagements, over quickly and leaving few opportunities for detailed psychic analysis. Aldrich's extended exposure to the WH40K field, combined with his millennium of experience and his precise psychic senses, provided the most detailed account the Grey Knights had ever received. Several key insights emerged from his debriefing. First, the WH40K field, while psychic in nature, operated on fundamentally different principles than chaos energy. Where chaos sought to corrupt and transform, the WH40K field simply enabled and amplified. It did not care what it was used for, only that it was used enthusiastically and with absolute confidence. This made it both less dangerous than chaos in some ways and more difficult to counter in others. Second, the field's strength was directly proportional to both the number of Orks present and their emotional state. A small group of dispirited Orks generated minimal energy. A large, excited warband could warp reality in measurable ways. This explained many historical accounts of Ork technology performing far above its theoretical capabilities during major wars. Third, and most concerning, the field could partially affect even those who were not Orks. Aldrich's weapons had functioned more reliably than they should have. His ammunition had lasted longer than predicted, because the Orks believed he should be a proper challenge. This suggested that the WH40K field was not merely affecting Ork technology, but subtly adjusting probability itself. The implications for Imperial strategy were significant. Standard tactics assumed that Ork technology was unreliable, and that this unreliability could be exploited. But Aldrich's report suggested that during a major WH40K, when the psychic field was at its strongest, Ork technology might actually be more reliable than usual. This meant that the longer a WH40K was allowed to continue, the more dangerous it became, not just because it attracted more Orks, but because those Orks would be fighting with enhanced effectiveness. The Grey Knights began updating their tactical doctrines to account for this. When facing Orks in large numbers, priority should be given to disrupting their coordination and enthusiasm, rather than attempting to engage in a straightforward battle of attrition. Psychic attacks should focus not on the Orks themselves, but on the WH40K field, trying to dampen it, before it could reach critical strength. Aldrich's experience also raised questions about the nature of Ork psychology. The fact that Gutgrinder had been willing and able to negotiate a truce, however temporary, suggested that Orks were more complex than most Imperial commanders gave them credit for. They were not mindless berserkers, but warriors with their own code of conduct, their own understanding of honor and fair play, crude though it might be. This did not change the basic Imperial policy toward Orks. They were still Xenos to be purged wherever found, but it suggested that in certain circumstances, temporary tactical accommodations might be possible. The Inquisition, upon learning of Aldrich's experience, began researching historical instances of similar arrangements, finding surprisingly many cases where Imperial commanders had made short-term truces with Ork warbands when strategic necessity demanded it. As for Gutgrinder's WH40K, it continued to plague that sector of space for several more years. The story of the battle with the Silver Giant became a legend among the Orks, told and retold with increasing embellishment until it bore little resemblance to actual events. In the Ork version, Gutgrinder had fought the Dreadnought single-handed for 3 days straight, finally earning the Yumi's respect through sheer toughness. This legend actually caused problems for Imperial forces in the region. Young Orks, hearing the story and wanting to prove themselves, would actively seek out Grey Knight's forces, hoping to earn similar glory. Several small Ork raids specifically targeted worlds where Grey Knights were known to operate, turning what should have been straightforward purging operations into running battles across multiple systems. The Grey Knights eventually dealt with Gutgrinder directly, though not in the way he might have expected. Rather than deploying a strike force to kill him, which would likely just make him a martyr and further enhance his legend, they instead spread rumors through captured Ork prisoners that Gutgrinder had been scared by the Dreadnought, that he had run away and made a deal like a cowardly grot. In Ork society, where reputation was everything, such accusations were devastating. Gutgrinder found himself challenged constantly by subordinates who thought they could do better. He won these challenges because he was genuinely a skilled warrior, but the constant fighting weakened his wag. Followers began drifting away to join more proper war bosses, ones who had not made deals with the enemy. Within a year, Gutgrinder's WH40K had fractured, splitting into a dozen smaller warbands that were far easier for Imperial forces to handle. The war boss himself survived, still dangerous, but no longer the threat he had been. The last reports placed him leading a relatively small warband in the Outer Rim, still telling stories about the time he fought a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, still claiming it was the best fight of his life. Back on Titan, Aldrich resumed his duties with the chapter. The crude Ork repairs were removed and replaced with proper Imperial craftsmanship. His weapons were blessed anew, his armor reinscribed with fresh wards, his systems fully restored to their original specifications. The 1,000-year gap in his service was noted in the chapter's records, but there was no shame in it. He had been lost through no fault of his own, and his awakening and survival against overwhelming odds only added to his legend. He was deployed several more times over the following decades, fighting in battles against demonic incursions across the sector. Each time he awakened, he wondered if he would dream of demons, or of that strange afternoon when he woke up in an Ork workshop and had to fight his way out. Often, it was the Orks he dreamed about, their crude enthusiasm somehow more memorable than the malevolent hatred of demons. Perhaps it was because fighting demons was what he had been created to do. It was expected, familiar, part of his core purpose. Fighting Orks, negotiating with a war boss, being repaired by a big mech. These were novel experiences, outside the boundaries of his normal existence. They had reminded him, in a strange way, that the galaxy was vast and full of surprises, that even after 1,000 years of service, he could still encounter something new. Or perhaps he just appreciated that the Orks, in their own crude way, had actually kept their word. In a galaxy filled with betrayal and corruption, with promises broken and oaths forgotten, there was something almost refreshing about dealing with beings whose primary motivation was simply wanting a good fight. Not that this made them any less dangerous or any less deserving of purging. of course. But it did make them interesting, in their own terrible way. The galaxy is a dark and violent place, filled with horrors beyond mortal comprehension. But it is also vast and strange, capable of producing encounters and situations that no one could predict or plan for. And sometimes, just sometimes, those encounters result not in tragedy, but in survival, not in corruption, but in strange mutual understanding, not in death, but in stories worth telling. Even if those stories involve a Grey Knight's Dreadnought, an Ork war boss, and a workshop full of confused mech boys. Conclusion. So what happens when Orks find a Grey Knight's Dreadnought that has been asleep for 1,000 years? As we have seen, the answer is complicated, violent, occasionally absurd, and thoroughly in keeping with the dark, chaotic nature of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The Orks, in their simple, direct way, saw something valuable and immediately tried to loot it, never considering that it might wake up or that waking it up might be a catastrophically bad idea. The Dreadnought, roused from millennia of sleep, responded with the kind of overwhelming violence that Grey Knights are known for, treating the Orks as a threat to be neutralized with extreme prejudice. But what makes this scenario interesting is not just the violence, though there was certainly plenty of that. It is the way both parties adapted to a situation neither had expected or planned for. The Orks, faced with an enemy they could not easily defeat, eventually recognized the value in negotiation. The Grey Knight, faced with tactical reality and strategic necessity, accepted a temporary truce that would normally be unthinkable. This encounter also highlights the fundamental differences between Orks and the other major threats the Imperium faces. Chaos seeks to corrupt and destroy. Tyranids seek to consume. Necrons seek to reclaim their ancient dominion. But Orks just want a good fight. They are not evil in any conventional sense, not driven by malice or hatred or hunger. They simply exist to wage war, to test themselves against worthy opponents, to experience the pure joy of combat. This makes them dangerous in ways that are hard to quantify. You can predict what chaos will do because its motivations are clear: corrupt, consume, destroy. You can predict what Tyranids will do because they follow biological imperatives. But Orks will surprise you because their motivations are emotional rather than rational, driven by enthusiasm rather than strategy. Yet they are not mindless. Gutgrinder showed tactical acumen in how he deployed his forces. Klobsnik demonstrated genuine engineering insight, however crude his methods. The Orks, as a whole, adapted their tactics in response to Aldrich's capabilities, learning from experience, even if they would never admit it in such formal terms. This is what makes the Orks such an enduring threat to the Imperium. They are not the most powerful enemy, not the most numerous, not the most technologically advanced, but they are resilient, adaptable, and seemingly impossible to permanently eliminate. Every Ork killed releases spores that will eventually grow into new Orks. Every defeat just makes them more determined to come back stronger. Every victory attracts more followers to the Waigi. And in a strange way, encounters like the one we have explored serve to strengthen both sides. The Orks learn that some enemies are truly dangerous, that caution has its place even in their violence-obsessed culture. The Imperium learns that Orks are more complex than they appear, that understanding your enemy is just as important as knowing how to kill them. For Brother Ancient Aldrich, the experience was a reminder that even 1,000 years of sleep cannot shelter you from the galaxy's chaos. The universe does not care about your plans or expectations. It will throw situations at you that make no sense, force you to make choices you never thought you would have to make, test your principles and your adaptability in equal measure. But that is the nature of service in the grim darkness of the far future. There is only war, yes, but war takes many forms, and the wise warrior learns to adapt to all of them. Sometimes that means fighting greater demons in climactic battles for the fate of worlds. Sometimes it means negotiating with an Ork war boss while covered in crude repairs and running on minimal power. Both are service. Both are duty. Both are part of the endless struggle that defines existence in the 41st millennium. And somewhere out there, on some distant battlefield, another dreadnought sleeps, waiting to be awakened. Who will find them? What will happen when they wake? These questions have no certain answers, because in this universe, certainty is a luxury no one can afford. But we can be certain of one thing. Whatever happens, it will be violent, it will be chaotic, and it will make for one hell of a story. Thank you for watching this exploration of what happens when Orks find a sleeping Grey Knight's dreadnought. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore and tactics of Warhammer 40,000, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There is always more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps us create more content like this. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the far future, there is only war, and sometimes that war is started by Orks who just cannot resist poking something that should have been left alone. For the Emperor, for Titan, for the Grey Knights.